If you're like me, then you've tasted just about everything that Neverwinter Nights has to offer at this point. Whether it's the original campaigns or the premium modules and fan works, both of the latter of which I've already made videos about, there is probably well clear of tens of thousands of hours of content to be savored in this game. Now, I've played my share, but one collection of modules that has always intrigued me are these three: the Dark Ranger's Treasure, the Winds of Eramor, and To Err is Human. And I found them curious because, well, they're clearly different from everything else. The other modules have huge descriptions and fancy banners, at least when viewed in the Enhanced Edition. These three have a stock image and a paragraph of text so short it wouldn't meet the word requirements for an elementary school paper. And yet they were, ostensibly, made by BioWare. There isn't even all that much information to be found about them online, if we're being totally honest. So, when I had time one afternoon, I fired them up. And, they're not exactly great. Let me give you a quick rundown of each one. The Dark Ranger's Treasure sees you stroll into the Inn of the Lance, where you stumble across a gnome by the name of Penryn Isric, who is thrilled to let you know about a bounty of treasure locked away in a crypt not far from the tavern. Naturally, you join forces to wade through the surrounding bog, cleaving through an abundance of bugbears and goblins along the way. When you actually reach the crypt, you find literally more treasure than you could ever hope to hold, and a letter from the Dark Ranger himself, who is totally cool with you taking his stuff if you so desire. When you leave, you've got to skedaddle back to the tavern because the swamp has been overrun with pixies and will-o-wisps. You sell whatever you could hold to the innkeeper, and the module ends. A storm forces you into port in Winds of Eramor, where you learn that you've had the brutal fortune to stumble across the dock as a terrible curse has blown into town. An evil entity by the name of Morgoth is resurrecting itself in a nearby crypt, and the captain of the hovel tasks you with dispatching him. After running through an absolute flash mob of nearly every undead creature you could think of, you reach the crypt, defeat Morgoth, rip out his heart, and return to the captain, who kindly tells you to leave for your own good. To Err is Human sees you stumble across a beaten and bruised group of rangers. They were ordered to rescue a noble's child before they were attacked by a group of drow and forced to retreat. The quest is turned over to you, wherein you track the drow to the cave they're holed up in, dish out some righteous condemnation of everlasting hero-ness, and find the kid. As it turns out, said kid is pretty obviously not a kid, meaning you got played for a fool by some higher being who wastes no time in slighting you for your perceived lack of intelligence. Either way, at least they were nice enough to give you $50,000 in gold for your troubles. It's not necessarily that these modules are bad per se, they're just incredibly shallow, and far more shallow than you would likely come to expect from adventures literally made by BioWare themselves. There's effectively no story beyond a simple premise, limited areas, no real voice acting, and certainly no extra bells and whistles. If anything, they feel a bit more like tech demos or demonstrations. And as I learned after doing a bit of research, these are, actually, for all intents and purposes, tech demos. All three of these modules, along with several others that aren't included in later releases of Neverwinter Nights proper but can still be found across the internet, were part of a series released well before the proper expansion packs or premium modules for the purpose of teaching players about the capabilities of the new Aurora toolset in which Neverwinter Nights was built within. Each is meant to show off a specific aspect of the engine's virtues. For instance, the Dark Ranger's Treasure shows off the audio system, with the swamp flooded with spatial sounds of frogs croaking and bugs buzzing. There was another module simply called Blackjack Inn that showed how strings could be written into dialogue, complete with an entire explanation of how the developers coded what they did on the old Neverwinter Nights website on which these examples were hosted. Part of the reason, I would imagine, for the creation of these adventures was so novices to the system could throw them into the toolset and pick through them, giving them hands-on information with regard to what the developers did. They're simple enough to get the point across, making them easily digestible for anyone that might be trying to learn from them. Outside of those educational aspects, however, the fact that BioWare would release official, more full-fledged content about a year later, as far as I can tell from looking through the archives, most of these demos were posted in mid to late 2002, and that the fanbase would get to work making their own adventures with alarming speed, means that, as far as gameplay is concerned, there is really no purpose for these demos today. That doesn't mean they aren't fun, mind you. For what they are, they can be quite enjoyable. To err as human is easily the best of the included three. It was meant to show off scaling combat, and if the internet is to be believed, dropping an exceptionally high-leveled character into the adventure can create some hysterical situations. They can all be played solo or with a group, and should, as far as I can tell, be compatible with most any character regardless of class or general makeup. But you're never going to play these for the experience they provide, if you get my meaning. And I can't help but wonder if it was really truly necessary for BioWare to crank these out at all. Don't get me wrong, I think it's great that they did. It's an outstanding way to reach out and connect with the community, but if I'm correct in what I could find that most of these examples cropped up somewhere in the fall of 2002, that basically means the original version of something like Siege of Shadowdale, which I covered the newer re-release of in a previous video, was about to be or already unleashed upon the world. Really does not seem like the community needed these instructions. Part of me has to wonder if when BioWare released these modules that they were more along the lines of what they thought fan-created works would be. You gotta remember, times were decidedly different back in the early aughts. Game modding was an established thing, sure. I covered a veritable source of such endeavors not all that long ago with Unlimited Adventures, but we were miles away from where we are today. It would be a long while before prospective gamers truly started crafting entire universes, jerry-rigging code, and, fixing Bethesda games. We've seen modders get hired at game studios proper in recent years. I sincerely doubt that was happening in the early 2000s, though I will admit that is conjecture on my part. If anything, Neverwinter Nights and its engine could likely be argued as the genesis of that sort of proliferation of the craft. I'm sure the team over at BioWare knew how powerful the Aurora engine was, but there's a huge difference between knowing what something potentially could do and actually predicting what those it was intended for would subsequently do with it. Either way, this wound up being something of a fun, if unexpected excursion through the early history of Neverwinter Nights. Who knows, maybe the value of these demos was far greater back in the day than can be adequately realized over 2 decades later. Maybe we've been the beneficiaries of some outstanding fan expansions because of what creators learned from these lessons. And that BioWare was willing to go to these lengths at all does leave me somewhat sad that we didn't get more official content from them before they moved on to other projects. Some cancelled premium modules, namely Hex Coda and Darkness Over Daggerford, eventually surfaced online, but those are discussions for another day, surely. I don't know if I would recommend you play any of these demos today, not unless you're acutely curious as I was, but it is kinda neat that we still have access to them, even if just for the way that they bring us back to simpler days. Neverwinter Nights has more content than I could hope to get through in a lifetime, but consider this interesting nugget checked off the list.